It's Friday, and that means one thing. It's ambulance day. So here we are, part 3 kicking off with Ben and I stripping off the axles off the Nissan chassis. So we started off with the rear axle. The idea was to keep one axle on both of the chassis so that we can move them about with a forklift. We did the front axle outside, so a little bit of heat and a bit of persuasion, and all the brackets dropped off the back. So we took it back out, brought in the ambulance with the forklift. So there's no axle in the front of this, it's just a suspended tow on the forklift truck. So brought that in and got it back on the car lift so that we could cut the U-bolts on the back because they were so corroded, and just belay the rear axle off the ambulance. And of course you have to wind the prop to wheel it out from underneath. So with that done, it was now time to start work on the Nissan axle. So the spacing of the springs was wider on the ambulance, and before anybody says this is casting, it's not. These spring mount brackets were welded on by Nissan, so I cut them off, ground them up and re-welded them in a different position. Here I'm using a spirit level to make sure that both of them are perfectly parallel with each other where I've set them to get the angle for the prop. So with that, Adam went underneath and bolted it all on, and we said goodbye to the Nissan chassis. She's been moved up to the top of the yard just in case you need any of the bits and bobs off it, but I'm pretty much done with that now. So what was a driving lorry is now a bare chassis, so that's a good investment clearly. So here's the front axle, took that off outside. This is the Nissan axle coming in on the forklift. This was much closer, well, almost perfect really for the width of the springs on the front. I am aware I'm probably going to have to take a couple of leaves out of the original springs, so because the original engine was an awful lot heavier than the Nissan one, and we're putting the engine further back. But Jane Springs at Birmingham are very good for that sort of thing. They've been in the business an incredibly long period of time, and they know exactly what they're doing. So any spring work, particularly leaf springs, Jane Springs in Birmingham. So we use this over centre thing.
Jesus!
After Adam had finished sounding the T horn but without actually making any T, he got on with the homemade folding attachment on the homemade press, making some temporary, and I emphasise temporary, U-bolts to mount the front axle as we're waiting on some longer ones to come in the post. So with that done, it was time to bring the engine in, drop it underneath on a pallet, and then use the forklift through the nose to lift it up. A bit awkward, this vehicle, of having the engine in the cab, but forklift made an easy job of it. We did have an idea of having the engine crane in the back of the van, but forklift did a perfect job of it. So as per usual, when you try to position an engine, lots of fiddling around, but we got it in.
Yeah.
The idea is that the seats will be mounted over the top of this engine, so the engine's got to be nice and low, but it's no lower than the axle, and this engine's designed to be under a seat. So this is when we discovered that we must have swept up 2 of the critical bolts we wanted to reuse, which were the engine mount nuts. So Ben decided to start sifting through all the stuff we swept off the floor, and I started trying to tap out a new one, and whoever won, we used that method. After that, it was time to fabricate a gearbox mount. So we did that, and Ben started cleaning up the inside of the chassis with this finger sander. Fantastic bit of kit, brilliant for getting in where you can't get in with an angle grinder. So this is the original Nissan engine mount. So we used that with a little bit of modification to go and slide in the chassis, fitting it on there. Once that was done, it was much easier to work because we knew where the engine was sitting, and it would just mount straight into the bracket and kept the original width. There's a quick pan of underneath. As you can see, there's a low sump on the sump portion on the Nissan. That's to do with keeping the oil cool. And with that done, we thought it was a nice sort of finishing off job to take off one of these tiny Nissan wheels and see if we could try on the much larger ambulance wheels, just to see how they fill the arches up again and give it its stance back. This is when we discovered that PCB was greatly different, and we're going to have to look at what sort of wheels we can put on to give it its proper classic look. Anyway, that's it for this one. Join in next Friday for part 4 and see how far we get.